Good afternoon everyone, I am April Crisitanola and for this video, we will gonna talk about the essay on criticism. So Alexander Pope in 1688 to 1744 published an expositions of the rules of classical school in the form of poem and essay on criticism. So imagine you love drawing pictures and someone writes a fun little poem to teach you how to make your drawings even better. That's what Alexander Pope did. He wrote a poem called An Essay on Criticisms to give tips about making good art, writing, and poetry. It's like a rule book but in rhyme, teaching people how to create and enjoy beautiful things in the right way. But before we proceed, let us first know who is Alexander Pope. So Alexander Pope, born in May 21, 1688, and died on May 30, 1744. He was an 18th century English poet. He is best known for his satirical verse, including Essay on Criticism, The Rape of the Lock, and for his translation of Homer. He is the second most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations after Shakespeare. Alexander is a translator, wit, satirist, and English poet of 18th century neoclassical age, or a time long ago when writers and artists wanted everything to look and sound perfect. They believed that rules, balance, and clear thinking were very important that time. Also, that time, some of their stories were funny and made fun of the bad behaviors like a cartoon showing a silly kid that monay ko sa neoclassical age. Alexander was born in a Catholic family and Catholic that time were subject to law so it couldn't rise in a society and he was taught to read by his aunt and went to Catholic schools in 1698 to 1699. So, Alexander, he encountered early health problems. From age 12, he suffered from patesis or it is a form of tuberculosis that affected his spine. That's why he only grew to a height of only 4.6 feet. And because he suffered from his disease, he educated himself by reading the classical works of writers such as Homer and Virgil. He was highly intellectual and considered as the greatest poet period. He is also considered as the prince of classicism. Because he got so fat, diba, he educated himself and he read the works of writers such as Homer and Virgil. So he got so fascinated and inspired that almost all of his works are influenced by Homer and Virgil and show love for classical things. So, because he was a very smart poet who lived a long time ago, people called him the Prince of Classicism because he wrote poems that followed strict rules just like how people back then admired old Greek and Roman ideas. So, among all Kuan, he is considered as the Prince of Classicism because of his great works that follows a strict rules. These are the major works of Alexander. In 1709, he published his first works, Pastorals. In 1711, an essay on criticism. In 1712, he published The Rape of Lock. In 1730, Windsor Forest. In 1715 to 1720, he translated the Iliad. In 1720 to 1725, the works of Shakespeare in 6 volumes. 1725 to 1726, the translation of Odyssey. In 1733 to 1734, an essay on man. Essay on Criticism was written on 1709 and published anonymously on May 15, 1711, and influenced by ancient poets and philosophers such as Aristotle. So an essay on criticism, this poem, it talks about how critics or people who judge books and writing should behave. Since Essay on criticism, it is inspired by the ancient philosophers Aristotle. Alexander says that a poem or a book should be fair, balanced, and follow the rules of good writing, the just like the philosophers such as Aristotle thought. Iron Criticism is the most quoted poem in English language because this poem is special because it is one of the most quoted poems in English. Alexander used a special kind of rhyme called heroic couplets where two-line rhymes with each other have a specific rhythm. So, written in heroic couplets, a discussion of what a good critic should do, Alexander began writing the poem early in his career, which took about 3 years to finish it at the age of 23. So Alexander wrote this poem early in his career, and even though he was young, he shared his smart ideas about writing and criticism. An essay on criticism is a poetry and criticism which broken into 3 parts. The first part opens by describing the way literary critics can actually cause harm. So the first part of an essay of a criticism begins by explaining how critics can sometimes do more harm than good. Alexander warns that some critics, instead of helping improve literature, actually cause damage by offering harsh and helpful judgment. For example, some critics manggol, they do not follow the good criticism. So instead of helping those writers, some critics manggol, they would immediately kanang criticize the writers without adhering or without following the rules of good criticism, which mo resulta siya nga ma-down ang writers. Mao biyang sa in our field sa mga teacher, gina-encourage gyud nila when you will give a feedback kana ang sandwich method, which is katong positive, then negative, then positive. Mao na siya dapat. The second part of an essay on criticism, Alexander lists the mistakes that critics make: overconfidence. So critics, of course, the critics nga who think they know everything and refuse to learn from other wisdom, makuan siya, gina-consider siya ni Alexander as a mistake. Second, ignoring the classics. So critic neglect the timeless rules and principles from classical writer like Aristotle, Horace, Plato. So according to Alexander daw, ignoring the rule ang ang classical rules man god, they are very di murag siya may base bitaw gyud sa literature. This classical philosophers, they really believe that following good rules in writing books and literature really have is really important. Bias and prejudice. Of course, if the critics, they let their personal preferences or biases influence their judgment, instead of evaluating based on reason and objective standards. Of course, in writing books or literature, you need to be fair. And you need to be sure that the information nga imong gisulat ana nga libro are all based on kanang standards or kanang facts. Imitating others. Critic follow trends or mimic other critics instead of developing their own thoughts and original judgments. And lastly, the excessive criticism or critics who focus too much pointing out flaws without recognizing or appreciating the good aspect of work. So, nakuha na siya sa kanina nga kuan that instead of helping those writers nga mo kuan pa sa ilahang field, ang some critics gid po di ay maka-down gid po siya sa mga writers, especially if ang kana nga critics they will only kanang they will always point out lang ang mga flows sa imuhang sa writers sa mga books or literature ana nga writer. Diba, in the second part of an essay on criticism, Alexander lists the mistakes that the critics made. Finally, in the part 3, Alexander finally offer a positive prescriptions after having laid out what's wrong with criticism in part 1 and 2. So, in sa part 2, kay overconfidence or not accepting anyone's ideas, sa part 3 daw, a critic should have a humility or should be humble and open-minded, recognizing that no one knows everything. So, dapat a good critic daw willing siya nga mudawat o kanang new information or new knowledge sa laing tao. Knowledge and learnings. A good critic constantly learns, stay open to new ideas, and study the works of past great writers. So again, a good critics daw is they should kanang open or naslay open and they are open-minded to accept new ideas from others, especially sa ilang mga kanang mga ancestors or katong mga nilang Horace, Aristotle, na they should still bisag dugay na they should still follow the good rules on criticizing. So balance. A critic should maintain balance, offering constructive feedback, not just focusing on flaws. Respect for traditions. A critic should respect classical principles that have stood the test of time, drawing inspiration from the past while offering original insight. So in this that respect for tradition, some writers diba sa mistakes that they do not follow na ang mga classical kanang rules. Pero if kanang a good critics daw kanang they should still willing dapat sila nga mo follow sa or mo respect sa traditional respect the classical principles because kanang mura man siya ang foundation sa literature until nowadays ang katong mga classical critics. Encouragement or of improvement. So a good critic should aim to improve art, literature, providing fair and thoughtful evaluation that help writers grow. So instead daw of bias and prejudice ang isa ka critics, they should aim to kanang improve art and literature. So a good critic should provide fair and thoughtful evaluations or kanang dili sila magkuan sa ilahang kanang personal preferences, instead they are willing to grow. So here are the key points of an essay on criticism. Balance and moderation. So Alexander advises writers and critics to avoid extreme and to maintain balance in their work and judgment. Of course, a good critic should maintain a balance in their work and judgment. So the famous line of balance and moderations by Alexander Pope is that for fools rush in where angels feared to tread. So this means that inexperienced people often take bold actions without understanding the consequences, while wise people approach situations carefully. In the context of criticism, it says that critics should be cautious and respectful rather than rushing to judgment. Imitations of nature. So Alexander stresses that good writing should reflect nature, which he views as a source of perfections and order. The second famous line of Imitations and Nature by Alexander Pope is that first follow nature and your judgment frame. So this line, it advocates that writers should base their works in the natural world and use it as their foundations. Good writing is grounded in the natural world's truth, simplicity, and beauty. Respect for classical rules. So Alexander, he encourages adherence to the time-tested rules of the classical traditions because Alexander, he is really fascinated by those classical philosophers such as kanang silang Homer, silang Virgil, silang Aristotle. So he really kuan na we should that a critic should really kanang adhere to the time-tested rules of classical traditions. Fourth, the humility and learning. So a writer or a critic should remain humble and open to learning and avoid arrogance. So, ang good critics or writers daw, they should have an kanang open mind to accept new ideas nga instead of being arrogant, willing sila nga maka-learn sa lain. The rule of the critic. A good critic should evaluate literature fairly guided by reason, taste, and should aim to improve art, not simply attack it. So, ang good critic daw, it should be to improve the art and not simply just kanang seeing the flaws in it, but also kanang to help the art improve bitaw, not only to see the flaws or etc. sa isa ka art.
Good morning. This is Nisal D. Tapitan from BSED English 3A. So since Miss Tanyola already introduced who Alexander Pope is, let's now dive into one of his most famous works entitled The Rape of the Lock. The Rape of the Lock is a satirical mock epic poem published in 1712, later revised in 1714. It humorously narrates a real-life incident where a young man, Lord Pittry, cut a lock of hair from a woman, Arabella Fermor, without her consent, causing a rift between their families. So, Alexander Pope wrote the poem to diffuse the tension and present the situation in a light-hearted, exaggerated manner. So, in the poem Rock of Luck, Arabella Fermor are portrayed as Belinda and Lord Petrie as Baron. The poem is divided into 5 parts. It started with the Canto 1 up to Canto 5. Since The Rape of the Lock is a longer poem with multiple sections, I'll just give a brief summary of key events and highlights from each canto. This way, we can understand the main storyline and its important moments without getting lost in the details. Let's begin with the Canto 1. The poem starts with a call to the muse and introduces Belinda, a stunning young woman. While she is sleeping, her guardian spirit, named Ariel, appears in her dream to warn her about some upcoming danger, but he doesn't explain what it is. When Belinda wakes up, she goes through a detailed beauty routine which is described in a fancy, exaggerated way as if it were something sacred. She gets ready for a day of fun and socializing. In the poem The Rape of the Lock, such women are protected by supernatural being called sylphs. That's why Belinda has a guardian spirit named Ariel because she is portrayed as a beautiful and virtuous young woman. Alexander Pope borrowed this idea from folklore and mythology, where spirits like sylphs were thought to guard specific aspects of nature or human life. In Canto 2, Belinda goes on a boat ride along the Thames River, looking so beautiful that everyone is amazed by her. One of her admirers, Baron, secretly plans to cut a lock of hair as a keepsake. He prays for his plan to succeed, while Ariel, her guardian spirit, instructs the other sylphs to protect her and her beauty. So, this guy named Baron is obsessed by the beauty of Belinda. So para niya, um is kadaugan gyud siya nga makakuha bitaw og something nga gikan ni Belinda. So mao to nagplan siya nga putlon ang lock of hair ni Belinda. In Canto 3, at a lively social gathering, Belinda plays a card game called Ombre, described as an epic battle. Afterward, the Baron seizes the moment to execute his plan. Armed with scissors, he stealthily cuts off a lock of Belinda's hair. The act is described in grand ways, heroic terms, but it marks a turning point as Belinda realizes what has happened. Since Baron is indeed obsessed by Belinda's beauty, he sees her beauty as something to be possessed, and he treats it as a trophy to claim. His obsession is not just about admiration, it's about control and conquest. He believes that capturing a part of her beauty will make feel him victorious. In Canto 4, Belinda is deeply upset when she realizes her lock of hair is stolen, and she reacts as if it's a huge tragedy. A mischievous gnome named Umbrel goes to a magical place called Cave of Spleen, which represents feelings of sadness and anger. There, he collects things to make people feel more upset. He brings this back to Belinda, making her emotions even stronger. And the last part is Canto 5. In Canto 5, the poem ends with a humorous argument between Belinda and Baron, where Belinda demands her lock of hair back. However, it's revealed that the lock has mysteriously disappeared. In a playful ending, Alexander Pope suggests that the lock has risen to the sky and turned into a star, making Belinda's beauty and the small event immortal. So that ends the poem. And now let's proceed to the themes of the poem. First is vanity and superficiality. Alexander Pope is poking fun at how people, especially in the aristocracy, focus too much on appearances and trivial things. For example, Belinda's outrage over a stolen lock of hair shows how something so small can feel like a huge deal in a world obsessed with beauty and reputation. So, the society often makes a big fuss over things that don't truly matter, showing how shallow human concerns can be. Next is mock heroic tone. So the poem takes a small, silly event and describes it in the style of grand epic, like the Iliad or the Odyssey. By doing this, Alexander Pope makes the situation seem ridiculous, showing how people exaggerate minor conflicts. So in everyday life, it can be humorously over dramatized, especially when pride or ego is involved. And lastly, the gender dynamics and power. The poem reflects the tension between men and women in the social games of courtship. The Baron's act of stealing Belinda's hair is playful, but it also shows how women were objectified and their beauty seen as a prize. Belinda fights back, demanding respect, but society doesn't take her outrage seriously. So, Alexander Pope subtly criticizes how men and women interact, showing the unequal power dynamics and pressure placed on women to maintain their beauty. So, Alexander Pope's poem is both funny and clever. It highlights how people, especially the rich, care too much about appearances and trivial problems. By exaggerating everything, he shows how silly these concerns are, while also giving a glimpse into the pressures and dynamics of 18th century society. That's all. Thank you.